I found a message from Joseph, Elliot's manservant, to tell me that Elliot was ill in bed and would be glad to see me. So next day I drove over to Antibes. Joseph, before taking me up to see his master, told me that Elliot had an attack of uremia and that his doctor took a grave view of his condition. He had come through and was getting better, but his kidneys were diseased and it was impossible that he should ever completely recover. Joseph had been with Elliot for 40 years and was devoted to him, but through his manner it was regretful. It was impossible not to notice the inner satisfaction with which, like so many members of his class, catastrophe in the house filled him. C'est pas vrai, monsieur, he sighed. Evidently he had his manias, but at bottom he was good. Sooner or later he must die. He spoke already as though Elliot were at his last gasp. I'm sure he's provided for you, Joseph, I said grimly. One must hope it, he said mournfully. I was surprised when he ushered me into the bedroom to find Elliot very spry. He was pale and looked old, but was in good spirits. He was shaved and his hair was neatly brushed. He wore pale blue silk pajamas, on the pocket of which were embroidered his initials surmounted by his count's crown. These, much larger and again with the crown, were heavily embroidered on the turned-down sheet. I asked him how he felt. Perfectly well, he said cheerfully. It's only a temporary indisposition. I shall be about again in a few days. I've got the Grand Duke Dmitri lunching with me on Saturday, and I've told my doctor he must put me to rights by then at all costs. I spent half an hour with him, and on my way back out asked Joseph to let me know if Elliot had a relapse. I was astonished a week later when I went to lunch with one of my neighbors to find him there. Just for the party, he looked like death. You oughtn't be out, Elliot, I told him. Oh, what nonsense, my dear fellow. Frida is expecting the Princess Mafalda. I've known the Italian royal family for years, ever since poor Louisa was in post at Rome, and I couldn't let poor Frida down. I did not know whether to admire his indomitable spirit or to lament that at his age, stricken with mortal illness, he should still retain his passion for society. You would never have thought he was a sick man, like a dying actor when he has the grease paint on his face and steps on the stage, who forgets for the time being his aches and pains. Elliot played his part of the polished courtier with the accustomed assurance. He was infinitely amiable, flattering, attentive to the proper people, and amusing with that malicious irony at which he was an adept. I think I had never seen him display his social gift to greater advantage. When the Royal Highness had departed, and the grace with which Elliot bowed, managing to combine respect for her exalted rank and the old man's admiration for a comely woman, was a sight to see. I was not surprised to hear our hostess tell him that he had been the life and soul of the party. A few days later he was in bed again, and his doctor forbade him to leave his room. Elliot was exasperated. It's too bad this should happen just now. It's a particularly brilliant season. He reeled off a long list of persons of importance who were spending the summer on the Riviera. I went to see him every 3 or 4 days. Sometimes he was in bed, but sometimes he lay on a chaise lounge in a gorgeous dressing gown. He seemed to have inexhaustible supply for them, for I do not remember that I ever saw him in the same one twice. In one of these occasions, it was the beginning of August by now, I found Elliot unusually quiet. Joseph had told me when he let me into the house that he seemed a little better, so I was surprised that he was so listless. I tried to amuse him with such gossip of the coast as I had picked up, but he was plainly uninterested. There was a slight frown between his eyes and a sullenness in his expression that was unusual with him. "Are you going to Edna Novamali's party?" he asked me suddenly. "No, of course not." "Has she asked you?" "She's asked everybody on the Riviera." The Princess Novamali was an American of immense wealth who had married a Roman prince, but not an ordinary prince such as go for 2 a penny in Italy, but the head of a great family and the descendant of a condottiere who had carved out principality for himself in the 16th century. She was a woman of 60, a widow, and since the fascist regime demanded too large a slice of her American income to suit her, she had left Italy and built herself on a fine estate behind Cannes, a Florentine villa. She had brought marble from Italy with which to line the walls of her great reception room and imported painters to paint the ceilings. Her pictures, her bronzes, were uncommonly fine, and even Elliot, though he didn't like Italian furniture, was obliged to admit that hers was magnificent. The gardens were lovely, and the swimming pool must have cost a small fortune. She entertained largely, and you never sat down less than 20 at a table. She had arranged to give a fancy dress party on the night of the August full moon, and although it was still 3 weeks ahead, nothing else was being talked of on the Riviera. There were to be fireworks, and she was bringing down an orchestra from Paris. The exiled royalties were telling one another with envious admiration that it would cost her more than they had to live on for a year. "It's princely," they said. "It's crazy," they said. "It's in bad taste," they said. "What are you going to wear?" Elliot asked me. "But I told you, Elliot, I'm not going." "You don't think I'm going to dress myself up in a fancy dress at my time of life?" "She hasn't asked me," he said hoarsely. He looked at me with haggard eyes. "Oh, she will," I said coolly. "I dare say all the invitations haven't gone out yet." "She's not going to ask me." His voice broke. "It's a deliberate insult." "Oh, Elliot, I can't believe that. I'm sure it's an oversight." "I'm not a man that people overlook." "Anyhow, you wouldn't have been well enough to go." "Of course I should. The best party of the season? If I were on my deathbed, I'd get up for it. I've got the costume of my ancestor, the Count de Lorry, to wear." I did not quite know what to say, and so remained silent. "Paul Barton was in to see me just before you came," Elliot said suddenly. I cannot expect the reader to remember who this was, since I had to look back myself to see what name I had given him. Paul Barton was the young American whom Elliot had introduced in London society, who had aroused his hatred by dropping him when he no longer had any use for him. He had been somewhat in the public eye of late, first because he had adopted British nationality, and then because he had married the daughter of a newspaper magnate who had been raised to the peerage. With this influence behind him, and with his own adroitness, it was evident that he would go far. Elliot was very bitter. Whenever I wake up in the night and hear a mouse scratching away in the wainscot, I say, "That's Paul Barton climbing. Before me, my dear fellow, he'll end up in the House of Lords. Thank God I shan't be alive to see it." "What did he want?" I asked, for I knew as well as Elliot that this young man did nothing for nothing. "I'll tell you what he wanted," said Elliot, snarling. "He wanted to borrow my Count de Loria costume." Nerve! Don't you see what it means? It means he knew Edna hadn't asked me and wasn't going to ask me. She put him up to it. The old bitch. She never have got anywhere without me. I gave parties for her. I introduced her to everyone she knows. She sleeps with her chauffeur. You knew that, of course. Disgusting. He sat there and told me that she's having the whole garden illuminated. And there are going to be fireworks. I love fireworks. And he told me that Edna was being pestered by people who were asking for invitations. But she had turned them all down because she wanted the party to be really brilliant. He spoke as though there were no question of my being invited. "And are you lending him the costume?" "I'd see him dead and in hell first. I'm going to be buried in it." Elliot, sitting up in bed, rocked to and fro like a woman distraught. "Oh, it's so unkind," he said. I hate them all. They were glad enough to make a fuss of me when I could entertain them, but now I'm old and sick and they have no use for me. Not 10 people have called to inquire since I've been laid up, and all this week only one miserable bunch of flowers. I've done everything for them. They've eaten my food, drunk my wine. I've run their errands for them. I've made their parties for them. I've turned myself inside out to do them favors, and what have I got out of it? Nothing. There was not one of them who cares if I live or die. Oh, it's so cruel." He began to cry. Great, heavy tears trickled down his withered cheeks. I wish to God I'd never left America. It was lamentable to see that old man, with the grave yawning in front of him, weep like a child because he hadn't been asked to a party. Shocking, and at the same time almost intolerably pathetic. "Never mind, Elliot," I said. "It may rain on the night of the party. That'll bitch it." He caught up my words like a drowning man we've all heard about at a straw. He began to giggle through his tears. "I've never thought of that. I'll pray to God for rain as I've never prayed before." "You're quite right. That'll bitch it." I managed to divert his frivolous mind into another channel and left him, if not cheerful, at least composed. But I was not willing to let the matter rest. So, on getting home, I called on Edna Novamalian, saying I had to come to Canis next day, asked if I could lunch with her. She sent a message that she'd be pleased, but there'd be no party. Nevertheless, when I arrived, I found 10 people there besides herself. She was not a bad sort, generous and hospitable, and her own great fault was her malicious tongue. She could not help saying beastly things about even her intimate friends, but she did this because she was a stupid woman and knew no other way to make herself interesting. Since her slanders were repeated, she was often not on speaking terms with the objects of her venom, but she gave good parties, and most of them found it convenient after a while to forgive her. I did not want to expose Elliot to the humiliation of asking her to invite him to her big do, but waited to see how the land lay. She was excited about it, and the conversation at luncheon was concerned with nothing else. "Elliot will be delighted to have an opportunity to wear his Philip II costume," I said casually as I could. "I haven't asked him," she said. "Why not?" I replied with an air of surprise. "Why should I? He doesn't count socially anymore. He's a bore and a snob and a scandalmonger." Since these accusations could with equal truth be brought against her, I thought this a bit thick. She was a fool. Besides, she added. I want Paul to wear Elliot's costume. He'll look simply divine in it. I said nothing more, but determined by hook and crook to get poor Elliot the invitation he hankered after. After luncheon, Edna took her friends out into the garden. That gave me a chance I was looking for. On one occasion I had stayed in the house for a few days and knew its arrangement. I guessed that there still would be a number of invitation cards left over and that they would be in the secretary's room. I whipped along there, meaning to slip one in my pocket, write Elliot's name on it, and post it. I knew he was much too ill to go, but it would mean a great deal for him to receive it. I was taken aback when I opened the door to find Edna's secretary at her desk. I had expected her to be still at lunch. She was a middle-aged Scotch woman called Miss Keith, with sandy hair, freckled face, pince-nez, and an air of determined virginity. I collected myself. The princess is taking the crowd out into the garden, so I thought I'd come in and smoke a cigarette with you. You're welcome. Miss Keith spoke with a Scotch burr, and when she indulged in the dry humor which she reserved for her favorites, so she broadened it to make her remarks extremely amusing. But when you were overcome with laughter, she looked at you with pained surprise, as though she thought you daft to see anything funny in what she said. I suppose this party is giving you a hell of a lot of work, Miss Keith, I said. I don't know whether I'm standing on my head or heels. Knowing I could trust her, I went straight to the point. Why hasn't the old girl asked Mr. Templeton? Miss Keith permitted a smile to cross her grim features. You know what she is. She's got it down on him. She crossed his name out on the list herself. He's dying, you know. He'll never leave his bed again. He's awfully hurt at being left out. If he wanted to keep in with the princess, it'd have been wiser not to tell everyone that she goes to bed with her chauffeur, and him with a wife and 3 children. And does she? Miss Keith looked over at me, over her pince-nez. I've been a secretary for 21 years, my dear sir, and I've made it a rule to believe all my employers as pure as the driven snow. I'll admit that when one of my ladies found herself 3 months gone in the family way, when his lordship had been shooting lions in Africa for 6, my faith was sorely tried, but she took a little trip to Paris. A very expensive little trip it was, too, and all was well. Her ladyship and I shared a deep sigh of relief. Miss Keith, I didn't come here to smoke a cigarette with you. I came to snitch an invitation card and send it to Mr. Templeton myself. That would have been a very unscrupulous thing to do. Granted. Be a good sport, Miss Keith. Give me a card. He won't come, and it'll make the poor old man happy. You've got nothing against him, have you? No, he's always been very civil to me. He's a gentleman. I will say that for him, and that's more than you can say for the most of the people who come here and fill their fat bellies at the princess's expense. All important persons have about them someone in a subordinate position who has their ear. These dependents are very susceptible to slights, and when they are not treated as they think they should be, will, by well-directed shafts, constantly repeated, poison the minds of their patrons, against who have provoked their animosity. It is well to keep in with them. This Elliot knew better than anybody. And he had always a friendly word and a cordial smile for the poor relation, the old maid-servant or the trusted secretary. I was sure he had often exchanged pleasant badinage with Miss Keith, and at Christmas had not forgotten to send her a box of chocolates, a vanity case, or a handbag. Come on, Miss Keith, have a heart. Miss Keith fixed her pince-nez more firmly on her prominent nose. I am sure you wish me to do nothing disloyal to my employer, Mr. Maugham. Besides which, the old cow would fire me if she found out I've disobeyed her. The cards are on the desk in their envelopes. I am going to look out of the window, partly to stretch my legs, which are cramped from sitting too long in one position, and also to observe the beauty of the prospect. What happens when my back is turned, neither God nor man can hold me responsible for. When Miss Keith resumed her seat, the invitation was in my pocket. "It's been nice to see you, Miss Keith," I said, holding out my hand. "What are you wearing at the fancy dress party?" I am a minister's daughter, my dear sir," she replied. "I leave such foolishness to the upper class. When I have seen that the representatives of the Herald and the Mail get a good supper and a bottle out of our second-best champagne, my duties will be terminated, and I shall retire to the privacy of my bedchamber with a detective story."